My friends, good morning. Look at this video. It's the morning of October 18, 2022 in Marietta, Ohio. It's 7 o'clock in the morning. More or less, the sun hasn't risen yet. And there's a plane that was on approach to runway 21 at the airport, which suddenly leaves its descent path and falls straight down. Like a pen falling off a desk, there were two people inside, two experienced pilots. 2,000 flight hours for the one sitting on the left, 2,500 for the other, who was helping him out that day. So what happened? Why? A plane suddenly and mysteriously went into a dive, even though just seconds before you could hear their voices talking to air traffic control as if nothing was wrong.
King Air 515, this is Doc Hill at Green Park Tower. Report makeup, Doc Hill.
No mayday, no major alert, no anomaly. Suddenly the aircraft dives and ends up crashing into the ground. We're going to tell this story, we're going to go through it, understand what happened before that, check the description or the pinned comment. I've opened a new YouTube channel, Aviation, as a continuation of this one. Here, every time we tell a story related to aviation safety, accidents, incidents, but each time there's a dose of theory inside, each time a theoretical reminder along the way, like today, for example. But on that channel, it will be purely about aeronautical theory. If you're interested, subscribe, and above all, share with people you know, WhatsApp, email. It will help me launch this channel. So I want to tell you that there's something you need to know. Sometimes there are omissions in the way we speak, in the way we teach, that can be deadly. To tell you in a school, this plane isn't certified for icing, be careful, we can't fly. Sometimes inside there's even a red panel like this, it's written on it, this plane is not certified for known icing conditions. And then on the contrary, this plane is certified for icing. This kind of statement is dangerous because it's not precise, it's actually vague. And all the aviation authorities insist on this. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency, the National Transportation Safety Board, which is the American Accident Investigation Bureau. You'll also find this in the manuals of various planes. There is no plane that is certified for severe icing. It simply doesn't exist. So yes, there are certifications for light and moderate icing, but there is no certification. You have to understand it as a blank check. You'll often see it written in black and white. In the documentation from the aviation authorities, it says that yes, there are often icing conditions that exceed the aircraft's certification. It's a bit like with cars, of course. There are European regulations, American ones, all that. But there is no certification for a car that requires the vehicle to be driven at 200 kilometers per hour into a concrete wall. You also need to show that nothing happens to the occupants, which isn't covered by certification. Severe icing is outside of aircraft certification, even for those certified for heavy icing. In other words, it creates widows and orphans. So what happens is that we have this aircraft that's going to take off very early in the morning from Columbus, Ohio, as always, and then it's going to climb to flight level 110. It's going to head toward Marietta, and there are two people on board. There's a guy sitting on the left. See, he's a pilot who's 49 years old with 2,000 flight hours. To his right, there's another pilot, 45 years old with 2,500 flight hours. So we have people who are experienced and they're on their way to Marietta to pick up people who are waiting for them, to transport them somewhere else. People who, by the way, were very lucky. In fact, we suspect that they were doing illegal Part 135 operations. That means that the flight officially, according to the flight plan, was Part 91, meaning a private flight. There's Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which is the federal regulations related to aviation. That defines several ways to operate an aircraft. Part 91 is private, 135 is air taxi, charter flight, and on demand you pay for a flight to be organized in your interest. And then, of course, there's 121, which are the regular flights, scheduled flights, airline flights, right? So, unfortunately, we often have pilots who secretly do Part 135 flights. So as I was saying, what happens is that the day before and even during the night, there were weather bulletins that were, you couldn't be clearer, that said there was a risk of icing. a significant risk of severe icing. Up to 80% risk was announced over an altitude range from 2,000 to 12,000 feet. Normally, in a normal situation, if we lived in a normal world, pilots check this message and decide to alter their flight accordingly. What does it mean to alter a flight? The weather can force us to. Either a go or a no-go. It means we go or we don't. We might not make the flight, or we might alter the flight. It means flying differently, flying at another time of day, waiting for that risk to dissipate. For example, later, when the sun has risen, the temperatures will go up, or flying at altitudes that are outside of that risk. Especially since our King Air, we're in the King Air 90. It's a very capable aircraft, pressurized, twin turbo, clean. So it can climb well above 12,000 feet and stay comfortable. Except that our pilots will fly at 11,000 feet. They'll do the whole flight at 11,000 feet. So they're right in that zone where there's a very strong presence of icing. So it's not said that they checked the weather. It seems it wasn't even checked. In any case, they arrive in the region, talk to the air traffic controller as if everything is normal. They're cleared to descend to 4,000 feet. They descend to 4,000 feet. They're still in an area with a high concentration of icing. So the icing that day was in the form of supercooled large droplets, which are supercooled large droplets. So how does it work? If you look at 0 degrees, when you take 0 degrees, well, 0 degrees is the temperature at which water melts. Water, if it's in ice form at 0 degrees and above, it starts to melt. On the other hand, if we look at things the other way, we can't necessarily say that below 0 degrees. As soon as we go below 0 degrees, water becomes solid. That's not true in clouds. It's not always true. That means if you look at clouds from 0 to minus 15 degrees, you mostly have supercooled water inside them. That means you have water that can be at less than minus 10 degrees, but it's still liquid. It hasn't started to crystallize yet. It hasn't encountered a crystallization nucleus. So yes, it's at minus 10, minus 12, minus 15, but actually it's liquid. It's not in the form of ice. Between minus 15 and minus 40, we have clouds that are a mixture of supercooled water and ice crystals. The closer we get to minus 40, the higher the proportion of ice compared to supercooled droplets. Below minus 40, it becomes very difficult to find supercooled water, except in certain situations. For example, when it comes to clouds like cumulonimbus, because the water is drawn from lower layers and projected to high altitude. So that's a very particular case because it's water that's sprayed from lower layers. Actually, if you want, what is it? The problem with supercooled water is that as soon as it hits something, it freezes immediately. I'll give you an example. I saw this phenomenon once in my life. It was quite impressive. I had put a bottle of water in the freezer, and then I think the next day or in the afternoon, I remembered that I had forgotten a bottle of water. So I thought, oh no, it's going to break. So I run to the freezer, I open it, and then what do I realize? The bottle was there, the water was inside, it was transparent, it hadn't frozen, even though it had been in the freezer for a very long time. Actually, just as I'm about to grab it, I hear a loud crack and the water freezes all at once, right before my eyes with a crack. There was a wave that went like that through the bottle, and then it froze, it became opaque, with ice inside, broken and all that in just a second. So it was water that was in a supercooled state. So what's happening is that our plane is arriving, so we authorize it to begin its descent. It descends to 2,800 feet and then it breaks through below the clouds. And it will get clearance to land. The air traffic controller tells him there's a vehicle on the runway, but don't worry, it will clear out. It's a vehicle that was there to scare away some birds that had been spotted. So he tells him, don't worry about the vehicle, continue your approach. The pilots say, okay, everything's fine. And suddenly, as I told you, we're going to see on several surveillance cameras, we're going to see this. Very brutal, it goes vertical. If you look, compare the lights, the strong light at the front is the light at the landing gear. The white lights at the back are the lights all the way at the rear. So if you look at that, it lets you see. There are even, from certain angles, you can see the navigation lights at the tips of the wings. So we have a plane that's vertical. Actually, what happened is this. Look, while our plane is approaching this area, the ground temperature is 3 degrees. You should know that we lose 6.5 degrees, roughly, for every 1,000 meters on average. So he feels negative temperatures starting from 500 meters above the ground, 1,500 feet. Roughly, we're in temperatures that drop below zero. So there are high risks of supercooled water. And there was some that day. So if you take the tailplane, and that's what's most important in our story here, take the tailplane, and that's water. Look, it's evolving like this. So I have water that's coming onto the tailplane, except that here we might have 28 degrees, but at that moment we have a negative temperature with supercooled water. So the water is still liquid. But when it hits the fuselage, the tailplane, well, what will it do? It will freeze immediately. So what it will do is degrade the aerodynamic qualities of the airplane's horizontal stabilizer here. So it will degrade it more and more. Now, you should know one thing. In most airplanes, there are two wings. The big one, which you see here, and a small one here at the back on the tail. They have opposite roles to each other. This one lifts the airplane. It generates lift. That one, what does it do? It creates downforce. It pushes downward. Okay, because the center of gravity in most airplanes is in front of the center of lift. So you have the center of gravity, for example, here, and the center of lift is here. So without that, what does the airplane do if there's no tailplane? The airplane will tip over. That's normal. So what we do is we create downforce, which is on the small wing at the back. So it's a wing that flies upside down in a way. It's a wing that always lives its life upside down, like an aerobatic plane flying upside down. So what it does is it creates downforce. And just like that wing, it can stall if the conditions are right. If the conditions are there for it to stall, it will stall. And if it stalls, what does our plane do? It does this. So the problem with this is that it's very hard to predict. It's very hard to predict, and it's very hard to train pilots for this. Why? Because quite simply, while we can train pilots to slow down and stall the main wing and therefore feel this approach to the stall and even the stall itself, it's not the same for the tailplane. There's no exercise for that. We can't simulate it easily. So what's happening here is that, see, if we have ice contamination, well, this one will stall more easily, and it will stall when, what will encourage it to stall? So to put it simply, I'm using the FAA's terms. Anything that increases the lift of the wings increases the risk of tailplane stall. That is, if the aircraft goes a bit faster, well, what will happen is the lift increases, so the downforce increases. Here it means that this one has to increase its angle of attack. So what's going to happen, bam, we're getting closer to a stall, especially since when you have a wing that's contaminated by ice, it stalls more quickly, it stalls at a much lower angle of attack. Another thing, if we extend the flaps, we're going to increase the lift of the wings. We're going to get closer, so the tailplane gets closer to stalling. So you see, as soon as you increase the lift here, this one is at a higher risk of stalling. So I was saying that the guys, they come in on their approach, and then at some point they deploy the flaps. So they start to slow down and deploy the flaps. What happens when they deploy the flaps? Well, we need the horizontal stabilizer to push more on the back of the King Air to keep it down, to prevent the King Air from tipping forward. So we're going to demand more from our horizontal stabilizer. We're going to pull back more on the yoke. We're going to trim more nose up. And at that point, what we'll get, if our stabilizer is very contaminated and about to stall, by doing this, what are we going to do? We're going to bring it to the edge. We're going to push it over the cliff. And that's what happened. It was extremely brutal. There have been quite a few accidents exactly like this one in history. And often there's no evidence that this was the case in this one. But often they're hidden by the autopilot. That means that the autopilot, when it's used, will hide from the human pilot the faults that the plane is starting to show. So if you're flying a plane manually, if there's a problem, even if you can't put it into words, you feel it. you feel that the plane is behaving strangely today. Whereas if it's the autopilot that's in control, it will compensate for that movement. It's the one handling the controls. And so the pilot is out of the loop. He won't see that there's a problem. He'll only notice it when he disconnects the autopilot or when the autopilot loses control. Quite simply, what happened is that our plane at one point started to dive. And honestly, there's no way to recover. Once it starts, that means once it starts, they're not very high. They're around 2,000. They go down vertically, like I told you. So they go down vertically in just a few moments. Once it's like that, there's no simple solution. There's no simple solution. On top of that, we're dealing with a tailplane that has stalled and there's no altitude to recover. So what's going to happen is that the speed will increase and then the aircraft will hit the ground. So what happened is that it crashed into the parking lot of a car dealership. Luckily, it was early, not yet open, and there were no customers. There was some property damage, some cars burned, the firefighters came and all that, but there was nothing to save. The One Transportation Safety Board found that the engines were working properly, the flight controls were okay, and there wasn't really a problem with the aircraft. But there you have it. Icing, especially on the adjustable horizontal stabilizer, got the better of those pilots. There you have it, my friends, a sad story. The people waiting on the ground barely escaped. And I'll see you in the next video. And let me remind you about the Parkour Tech channel, where there are already a few videos. You can subscribe and share. See you very soon, my friends.